There are documents that are read aloud in a great house, with the family ranged in their black, the lawyer's voice carrying down a paneled length of room to the chairs where the daughters sit. And there are documents that are read aloud in a small parlor with a fire of green sticks that will not quite catch, to one woman in a gray gown who has been called in from her bees. This was the second kind. The parlor belonged to the Mrs. Crewe's charity school for the daughters of poor gentlemen, which stood a short mile out of Ludlow on the Leominster Road, behind a hawthorn hedge and a wicket gate that wanted painting. And the morning was the 11th of October, 1818, a still gray forenoon with the first true cold of the autumn in it. The kind of morning that smells of wet leaves and cold stone, and that the bees, had anyone asked the bees, would have told you meant the end of the working year. The school's man of all work had come down the long flagged passage at a half run, which he never did, his boots loud on the stone, to say that a post-chaise had turned in at the wicket, a hired chaise, yellow-bodied. Splashed to the axle with Shrewsbury road mud, the postboy in a soaked drab coat blowing on his fingers, and that a gentleman in black had got down from it and asked, very particularly and by her full name, for Miss Lavinia Strangeways. And Miss Strangeways was not in the house. She was at the bottom of the physic garden, where the 6 straw skeps stood on their weathered oak stand against the south wall, doing the last of the autumn work that no one else at the school could be trusted to do, which was to weigh the year in her hand and write it down. She had her wide straw hat on, with the length of gray gauze veiling thrown back over the brim, because the cold had quieted the bees, and she did not need it down. And her rough tan leather gloves, and over her dove gray gown the fine charcoal spencer, buttoned to the throat against the chill, with the plain white tucker showing at her neck, and at her collar, small, dark, catching no light at all on such a morning, the little jet brooch that held, behind its oval of polished black, a coiled lock of her father's hair. She was 28 years old. She was of middle height and slender and very upright, and there was about her, even alone in a cold garden, with her arms full of straw and her breath showing, a quality of unhurried exactness, as though she did nothing that she had not first considered, and would do nothing faster than the thing required. Her hair under the hat was smooth and dark honey brown, center-parted, drawn into its low coiled knot at the nape with 2 or 3 soft wisps loosed at the temples by the work. Her eyes were gray, green, and grave. She had been lifting the last skep a finger's breadth on its stand to judge its weight against the others, for that is how an old hand tells which stock has stored enough to carry it through to spring and which is not. By the honest pull of the thing against the muscles of the arm, and she had a stub of black lead pencil in her gloved fingers, and the worn brown calf-pocket ledger open on the flat of the stand, its pages ruled in her own small, upright hand, skep by skep, a date, a weight, a word. Heavy, fair, light feed, she had just written light against the 4th when Mary came running down the gravel between the dead bean rows to say that there was a gentleman come from Shrewsbury in a chaise, asking for her by her name, and that the Mrs. Crewe begged she would come up directly. She did not come directly. That was the first thing, and it was a small thing, and it told you everything. She finished the line she was writing, light, feed, and she closed the pocket ledger on its faded ribbon and slid the pencil stub under the same ribbon to hold its place, and she set the skep down true on its stand so that it sat level and the cold bees within were not jolted. And only then did she draw off her leather gloves, finger by finger, and lift the straw hat from her head, and smoothed back the loosened wisps of her hair with the flat of her hand. A gentleman from Shrewsbury, asking by name, was either a thing of no consequence whatever or a thing of very great consequence, and in neither case would it be the better served by her arriving at the house breathless, with straw on her sleeve and her hair come down. So she walked up the garden at her ordinary pace, past the spent rose and the cold frames and the little stone seat where she did her summer figuring, and in at the garden door, and she gave the hat and gloves to Mary in the passage, and she went into the parlor composed. The gentleman in black rose from the hard chair by the window when she came in, and bowed and named himself Mr. Raysbury, of Raysbury and Pole, solicitors, of St. John's Hill in Shrewsbury. He was a man of about 60, thin and very upright, with thinning silver hair and gold-rimmed spectacles, behind which a pair of attentive gray eyes took her measure in a single unhurried glance, and seemed faintly to approve of what they found, for he had come a wet 30 miles braced, perhaps, for tears, or for a fainting fit, or for the kind of clutching eagerness that a stranger's chaise and a lawyer's black can raise in a poor gentlewoman's breast. And here instead was a grave young woman in half mourning, who shut the door behind her without haste, and gave him good morning in a low even voice, and asked whether he would take a chair nearer the fire, such as the fire was. He had a worn green baize document case under his arm. The Misses Crewe, two faded sisters who kept the school, and who had been hovering at the window in an agony of curiosity and propriety, were got rid of with a word. Mr. Raysbury's business was with Miss Strangeways alone, and was of a private nature, and they went out reluctantly, and the door was shut. And Lavinia sat down across the small table from the old solicitor, with her hands quiet in her lap, and waited for him to tell her why he had come. He did it properly. He was a careful man, and he did things in their order, and the chief thing he had to do, he plainly felt, was not to be misunderstood, and so, before he opened the green baize case, he said, looking at her steadily over the gold rims, that he was the bearer of news of a death, not, he hastened to add, of any near connection of hers, for he understood she had few living, but of a gentleman she might recollect to have heard named Mr. Josiah Quinnell, a private banker of Shrewsbury, lately deceased. And he watched her when he said the name, as a careful man will, to see what it raised. It raised very little that he could read. A small stillness, perhaps, a slight settling of the grave gray-green eyes, as of a person reaching back into memory for a thing held a long way off. Quinnell, she had heard the name, she said, twice in her life that she could be sure of. Once when she was a girl of perhaps 11, when her father had spoken it across the supper table to her mother in a tone she had not understood and had not forgotten, a tone of old gratitude, and something graver under the gratitude, and once, years after, in the reading of her father's own short will, where a small sum had been left, of all the strange directions a dying clergyman might give, not to Mr. Quinnell, but in trust for a charity that Mr. Quinnell was named as overseeing. She had never met the gentleman. She had never had a letter from him, nor written one. She had supposed him, in so far as she had ever thought of him at all, to be one of those distant figures from her father's life who belonged wholly to a past she had been too young to share. And now he was dead. 3 weeks dead, Mr. Raysbury said. He had died on the 20th of September last, quietly, at his house in Shrewsbury, an old man and a spare one, full of years, and the solicitor said it in the level way of a man laying down a fact he means to come back to, though Lavinia could not yet know that the date of that death was the hinge on which her whole future would presently turn. Then Mr. Raysbury opened the green baize case, and here he did a thing which he afterwards confessed to his partner Poll and to no one else that he had done on an impulse he could not entirely account for, against his own settled practice, for it was not the custom to read such an instrument out entire, word for word, to the party named in it. One summarized, one gave the sense. One spared the lady the dry, latinate weight of it. But there was something in the grave, attentive stillness of the young woman across the table, some quality of a mind that wished to have the thing exactly and not have it softened, that moved him, and so he drew out the deed itself, a folded skin of parchment heavy, with a great red wafer seal and a grained silk cord, and he settled his spectacles, and he read it to her aloud, from the first word. In the cold green smoking parlor, with the wet October light on the page. Know all men by these presents, he read, that I, Josiah Quinnell, of the town of Shrewsbury in the county of Salop, banker, being of sound and disposing mind and memory, do hereby grant, assign, transfer, and set over, absolutely and forever, and here the long climbing periods of the law went on, mortgages, bonds, covenants, the principal sum and the interest thereon accrued, and the arrears thereof unpaid, all that messuage, capital mansion house, and demesne known as Marsden Priory, with the lands, farms, tenements, and hereditaments thereto belonging, comprising by estimation 1,200 acres or thereabouts, lying in the parish of Marsden under Edge, in the said county of Salop. And Lavinia sat with her hands in her lap and let it climb, not stirring, following it, until it came at last to the clause it had been climbing toward, the operative clause, the one the old solicitor read a shade more slowly so that it should not go past her, until Lavinia Strangeways, spinster, only surviving child of the late Reverend John Strangeways, clerk, sometime curate of this county, to have and to hold the same unto the said Lavinia Strangeways, her heirs and assigns, to her sole and only proper use and behoof forever. It is a particular thing to hear yourself made the owner of a great house you have never seen, by a man you have never met, in the dead grammar of the law, on a wet morning, in a borrowed parlor. Lavinia heard it, and what she understood, for she had kept account books since she was 16, and could read the bones of a transaction through any quantity of Latin laid over them, was that she had not in fact been given a great house at all. That was the thing she fixed on first, before any other. That was the apiarist in her, weighing the skep in her hand to know the truth of it under the straw. Mr. Quinnell had not owned Marsden Priory. He had not been able to give her Marsden Priory, because Marsden Priory was not his to give. What he had owned, and what he had given her absolutely and forever, was the mortgage upon it, the controlling bond, the principal sum lent long ago against the lands and never paid back, and the whole accumulated weight of arrears of interest that had gone on mounting half year by half year in the locked ledgers of a private bank, while the family who lived in the house went on living in it as though it were wholly and freely their own. The Festings, Mr. Raysbury said, when she asked him the name of that family, an old, proud family, 2 generations seated at the Priory, who held the place, held it in the world's eye and in their own, but who held it in plain fact and in law only so long as the bond slept, and who did not know, the solicitor said, lowering his voice a little, though there was no one to hear, that the bond had ceased to sleep. They did not know it had changed hands at all. They believed it still lay where it had lain for years, a dead instrument in a dead banker's strong room, half forgotten, never called. They did not know that a clergyman's orphaned daughter who kept bees near Ludlow now held, in a folded skin of parchment with a green silk cord, the paper that could, if she chose, put them out of their own front door. She did not weep. Mr. Raisbury, telling it afterward, laid a small private stress on that, because it was the thing he had carried 30 wet miles half expecting, and it had not come. She did not weep, and she did not flush, and she did not, which he had also half expected, and would have thought no shame in a poor woman suddenly told she held the bond on 1,200 acres. She did not light up with any greed or triumph. She sat quite still for the length of perhaps 3 breaths, looking not at the solicitor, but at the middle distance, at the cold window and the gray garden beyond it, where her 6 steps stood, and then she came back from wherever she had gone, and she asked him a question. She asked him one question, and it was not the question he had been braced for. She did not ask how much the place was worth, nor what the arrears came to, nor whether she might truly turn the family out, nor why on earth a banker she had never met should have done such a thing. She asked him the date. She asked him to tell her precisely 2 dates, and to be sure of them, the exact day on which this deed of assignment had been executed and sealed. The day on which Mr. Quinnell had signed away the bond to her, and, separately, the date of the last entry standing to that bond in the books of the bank, the last half-year's interest reckoned, the last figure set down before the old man laid down his pen for good. Could Mr. Raisbury tell her those 2 dates, and would he set them down for her in writing before he went? The old solicitor looked at her then for a moment over his gold rims with a new and sharper attention, as a man looks who has expected a child and found a colleague. It was, he thought, an extraordinary question for a young woman to ask in the first 5 minutes of learning she was an heiress to such a thing, extraordinary and exactly the right one. The one question he should himself have wished her to ask, the question on which, though neither of them could yet see how far, the whole soundness of her holding would one day stand or fall. He could tell her, he said. The deed of assignment had been executed by Mr. Quinnell on the 3rd of September last, in his own chamber, before 2 witnesses whom he, Raisbury, could name and produce. The old gentleman had been failing then, but clear in his mind, very clear, and had been most particular that the thing be done correctly and the date entered true. And the bank's last entry to the bond, he turned that over, summoning it from memory, and in promising to verify it against the receipt book itself, which she should have, which by the terms of the bequest was now in law as much hers as the bond. The bank's last reckoning of interest had been carried down at the half-year, and there had been, he was nearly certain, and would make certain, no entry of any kind upon that account after Mr. Quinnell's death. After the 20th of September, the account had simply stopped, as a dead man's accounts do. He drew out a clean sheet from the green baize case, and he wrote the 2 dates for her in his neat legal hand. 3rd of September, the assignment, 20th of September, the death, and a note that the last entry stood at or before the former, and he passed the sheet across the small table, and she took it, and she read it, and she did not say why she had asked. She knew why she had asked, though she could not have said on that October morning what the asking would come to. She had kept books too long not to know the first law of all keeping, which is that a thing is only as sound as the date upon it, that a transaction without a true date is a door without a hinge, that the whole strength of a paper lies not in what it says it does, but in when it says it was done, and by a hand that was alive and able on that day to do it. She did not yet know of any Mr. Cradock festing, nor of any deed of redemption, nor of any Michaelmas audit on the 29th of September. She did not know that a forged discharge would one day be laid before her, dated 9 days after the very death whose date she now folded into her ledger. She knew only by an instinct as settled in her as the weighing of the skeps, that a great paper concerning a great property had come into her hands, and that the first thing to be certain of, before sentiment or scruple or any question of right and mercy could be entertained at all, was the simple skeleton of its dates. So she copied Mr. Raysbury's 2 dates into her own brown calf pocket ledger, on a fresh page after light feed in her small upright hand. And she sat a moment with her finger on the jet brooch at her collar, on the little hard oval of black that held her father's hair, and through him the memory of that long-ago supper-table and the grave, grateful tone in which he had once spoken this dead banker's name, and she made up her mind. She would not be content to have the thing read to her, and the deed left in a Shrewsbury strong-box, and a stranger's account of it taken on trust. A paper that could turn a proud family out of doors or spare them was not a paper to be governed at 30 miles' distance. She would go to Shrewsbury herself. She would put her own hand on the bond and on the bank's receipt book and read the dates with her own eyes, as she read the weight of a hive with her own arm. And she told Mr. Raysbury so, in her low, even voice, before he had so much as proposed it, that she would settle her small affairs at the school within the week, and travel up to Shrewsbury and take possession of the paper and the figures. And whatever it was that an old man 3 weeks dead had so particularly wished her, of all the souls on earth, to hold. She traveled up on the Tuesday following, in the common stage that ran from Ludlow to Shrewsbury by way of Church Stretton, and not in any hired chaise of her own, for she had spent her life among women who counted the cost of a thing before they admired it, and saw no reason to begin spending another man's money before she had so much as touched the paper that made it hers. The coach was an hour late at the Feathers, and smelt of wet straw and the orange peel of children who had been sick on the Bridgenorth road. She took the corner seat with her back to the horses, her brown calf pocket ledger in her reticule and her hands folded upon it, and let the talk of the other passengers, a corn factor, a stout farmer's wife with a basket of geese feathers, a young ensign asleep against the window with his mouth open, wash over her without once requiring her to answer it. She had a gift, much remarked upon by the Mrs. Crewe, and never once by herself, for being present in a room or a coach without troubling it. The same stillness with which she could stand a hand's breadth from a working hive and not be stung, and she used it now, watching the cold country go by the streaming glass, and thinking, in the orderly way she thought of everything, not of fortune nor of the great house she had never seen, but of dates, of a Michaelmas she had not yet been told to fear, of a death 3 weeks before it, of the plain arithmetic that, whatever else this business proved to be, 3 weeks was 3 weeks, and could not by any lawyer's art be made into none. The marches opened out about her as the coach labored up toward the long shoulder of the hills, and it was country she knew in her blood, though she had seen little enough of this particular corner of it, the small, steep fields stitched together with gray dry stone and dark hedge, the sheep moving like slow weather across the upper slopes, the ash trees already half stripped and the oaks still holding their rust, and over all of it, to the west, the great whaleback of the Long Mind lying along the sky like a sleeping thing, its flanks the color of a dead bracken fire, its top lost in a soft gray drift that was not quite rain and not quite cloud. Smoke stood up straight from the chimneys of the little stone towns. A buzzard turned, unhurried, over a wood. Twice they passed a shepherd who lifted neither hand nor head, and once a string of pack ponies with bells, coming down off the hill with bracken for bedding, and Lavinia, who had been taught by her father to love this country precisely because it asked nothing of you and gave nothing it had not earned. Felt for the first time since the lawyer's words in the green stick parlor something that was not quite dread and not quite hope, but only a great studying. That she was going up into a land of hard ground and honest stone, where a forged thing, she somehow believed, would show as plainly as a cuckoo's egg in a hedge sparrow's nest, if only one had the patience to count the eggs. Mr. Raysbury's chambers stood in a narrow paved court off the high street, behind a door of weathered oak with a brass plate so worn by 100 years of Shrewsbury thumbs that the name upon it was more memory than letter. And within, after the cold of the street, the rooms were close and brown and smelt of sealing wax, beeswax, old paper, and the particular dust that gathers only in the tin-deed boxes of the long dead. He received her himself, rising from behind a table heaped with green-tied bundles, a thin, upright old man with thinning silver hair and attentive gray eyes behind their gold-rimmed spectacles, in plain black superfine and a white cravat, with the air of a man who had spent 60 years learning that the surest way to alarm a client was to seem in any hurry. He had expected, he confessed, as he handed her to the one good chair, a letter. He had not expected the lady herself, and so soon, and travelled up by the common stage, and Lavinia said only, settling her gray skirts and drawing off her fingerless mittens, finger by finger, that a thing of this weight was not to be done by letter, any more than one weighed a hive by asking another man to lift it. He looked at her then a little longer than was strictly civil, as a man looks who has revised an opinion, and said that he saw they should do very well together, and rang for the box. The box, when the clerk had fetched it down and set it upon the table and withdrawn, was a black japanned tin-deed box with quenelle lettered upon it in flaking white, and a second, smaller, of plain grain painted iron, and Mr. Raysbury unlocked them both with keys from his own ring and stood back, with the particular delicacy of an old man who knows that some papers a person had better take up with her own hands or never feel were hers at all. So she took them up. The deed of assignment first, a single great sheet of stiff parchment folded in 3. The ink gone the brown of strong tea, the engrossing clerk's beautiful upright hand marching down it clause by clause, and at the foot the dead man's signature, Josiah Quennell, firm and small and a little crabbed, with a red wafer of a seal beside it and the names of the 2 witnesses below, and beneath that, pinned, the schedule of the principal sum and the long, sorry column of the arrears of interest upon the mortgage bond of Marsden Priory, Salop, 1,200 acres and the messuage and all that belonged to it, year upon year of unpaid interest set down in a banker's patient figures. She read it through twice, top to bottom, moving her lips at no word but missing none, her gray-green eyes level, her face giving back to Mr. Raysbury exactly as much as the parchment gave back to the window, which was to say, the cold clear light, and nothing more. Then she set it down and took up the receipt book. This was the thing she had most wanted, and she handled it as she handled a calm of capped brood, gently and without sentiment, the private receipt book of Quennell's Bank. A fat ledger bound in scuffed brown calf with a brass clasp, in which day by day and client by client, every payment received over the counter or by draft had been entered in the same crabbed hand or its clerk's, dated, summed, and ruled off. She found the Marsden Priory account by the index and turned to it and ran her pencil stub, not quite touching the page, down the column of dates, Lady Day. The autumn before that, back and back through the lean years, and not one entry, not one, against the principal of the bond, only interest, and that grudging and often short, and twice not paid at all. And there the entries simply stopped, in the early days of September, in a half-finished hand, as a ledger stops when the hand that kept it is taken away, and after that, blank ruled paper to the foot of the page and over the leaf, white as a field under the first snow. No payment, no discharge, no redemption, nothing at all. She looked up at Mr. Raysbury and said, in her low, even voice, that she was glad to have seen the book, that a deed might be copied and a seal might be counterfeited, but that a man's daily reckoning, broken off in the middle of a word, was a harder thing to forge than people suppose it, because to forge it, you must forge all the days on either side of it, too. The old solicitor took off his spectacles, polished them, and put them on again, which she came to know was the nearest he ever came to applause. It was as she was drawing the green tape once more about the assignment that he coughed. In the dry, deprecating way of his profession, and laid before her, with 2 fingers, a calling card that had been waiting on the corner of his table since before she came in. It was a large card, a little soiled at one corner, the name engraved in a flourishing modern hand, Mr. Craddock Festing, with an address at Marsden Priory beneath it and across the bottom. In a sprawling pencil that had pressed near through the pasteboard, the words will wait upon Miss S. At her convenience on a matter of the discharge. Mr. Raysbury said only that the gentleman was a connection of the family who lived at the Priory, that he had called twice already, the second time without leaving, and had been particular, very particular, in his enquiries as to when the new owner of the bond might be expected, and whether she had as yet examined the late audit. Lavinia turned the card once in her fingers, set it down upon the parchment, and did not pick it up again. But she asked her one question then, the question she had carried up from Ludlow, folded small in her mind like a pressed flower. Not what Festing wanted, nor what the discharge was, but only of the assignment, what date does it bear? The 4th of September, said Mr. Raysbury, consulting it, dated, signed, witnessed, and sealed the 4th of September last. And Mr. Quennell died, she said. The 12th, said the old man, the night of the 12th. She nodded once, as a person nods who has fitted a true figure into a true column, and said nothing of why she had asked, but she had her first fixed point now. Her first surveyor's stake driven into solid ground, the 4th, the 12th, and everything that this Mr. Festing might choose to build would have to be measured against it. She would not be hurried into the great house, and she would not creep up to it unseen. She lodged that night and the next at the Lion in Shrewsbury, in a clean low room over the yard where she could hear the ostlers and the coach horns, and she wrote 2 short letters and slept, by her own account, very well. But on the 3rd morning, a still bright morning with frost in the shadows of the walls and the Severn smoking under the bridge, she hired a quiet brown cob and a boy to show the road, and rode out the 7 miles to Marsden Priory under the western hills, because a thing you mean to be just about you had better first see with your own eyes. The road ran up off the river plain and into the folded country, and she had her first sight of the house from the brow of a lane between 2 thorn hedges It lay below her in its hollow of old parkland, long and low and gray. A great rambling pile of weathered limestone with mullioned windows and twisted Tudor chimneys and one older, graver wing, for the place had been a religious house before the Festings or any Festings grandfather ever held it, so that out of the tumble of gables there rose, plain and lovely and not at all proud, the worn gray cloister arch of the dead priory, its mouldings soft as a thumbed coin. An arch that had heard plain-song before it heard a single quarrel about money. Rooks went up from the elms about it in a slow black wheel. Beyond and above, filling all the western sky, the long mind lay tawny in the early sun, and along the foot of it she could make out the home farm, the long stone byre, the rick yard. The pale stubble fields running up to the open hill where sheep moved like spilled salt, and nearer, against the warm south face of the house, a walled garden. And within it she thought, though she could not be sure at that distance, the small domed shapes of bee skeps on a stand, which made her smile for the first time in 3 days, for it told her the place at least understood honey. She had not meant to go down, only to look, but the boy had run on ahead and spoken at the kitchen court, and so it was that she came to the Priory, not as a claimant at the great door, but as a quiet gray woman on a hired cob at the offices, and was met there by the housekeeper, Mrs. Tetlow, 58 and foursquare in charcoal bombazine and a crisp white cap, a heavy chatelaine of keys swinging at her waist, and a pair of kind, shrewd dark eyes that took the measure of a person in one honest look. There was a silence between them that might have gone badly, for the household, Lavinia understood at once, knew. Word had come up from Shrewsbury, perhaps from Festing's own lips, that the bond on the house had passed to a stranger, a nobody. A clergyman's orphan girl who kept books and bees at a charity school, and a lesser woman than Mrs. Tetlow might have shut the door in such a stranger's face. But the housekeeper looked at the gray gown and the jet mourning brooch and the plain weathered hands, and at the calf ledger Lavinia had not thought to hide, and something in her old servant's wisdom seemed to decide that whatever this was, it was not the gaudy ruin she had been led to dread, and she said, gruffly, that the lady had best come in out of the cold and take a glass of cowslip wine. For the master and Mr. Cradock were both from home, and an empty house kept no secrets worth the keeping. So Lavinia came in under the cloister arch and through cold-flagged passages, and was shown, half in grudging courtesy and half because Mrs. Tetlow plainly wished to see what such a one would do with it, into the south library, a long, low room, 2 stories of it, walled to the ceiling in books behind brass lattice, with 3 tall windows full of the southern light and the warm garden wall beyond, a great oak table black with age, a globe, a smell of leather and cold ash and lavender, and over the chimney-piece a dark old portrait that she did not yet know to look at twice. She stood in the middle of that room a long moment, turning slowly, and said quietly, more to herself than to the housekeeper, that whoever had loved this room had loved it well, and Mrs. Tetlow, behind her, unbent by another degree. It was not done all in a morning, nor graciously, but it was done. The deed of assignment, when Mr. Raysbury's clerk brought the formal notice up to the house 2 days after, was acknowledged, there being, in plain law, no possible way to refuse to acknowledge it by such of the household as had the standing to acknowledge anything in the absence of the family's head, and once the paper was admitted, the question of where the new holder of the bond should lodge became, awkwardly, unavoidable. She could not in decency be left at the Lion 7 miles off while her own business at the Priory was transacted. and to bring her under the family's own roof in the family's own wing was more than the proud festing blood could be expected to swallow. The compromise, when it came stiffly and through Mrs. Tetlow, who was plainly its real author. The West Wing, a quiet, self-contained range at the older end of the house near the cloister, with its own stair and a sitting room and a chamber that caught the afternoon sun and looked straight down upon the walled garden and the 6 bee skeps on their weathered stand, should be opened, aired, and made ready, and Miss Strangeways might lodge there until the matter of the estate was settled, as a person lodges who is neither guest nor mistress, but something the house has not yet named for. Lavinia accepted it exactly as it was offered, with no more and no less warmth than the offer carried, and was grateful in her heart for the bees beneath the window, which she counted from the casement that first evening 6 skeps, and a brass smoker, and a length of gray gauze hung to dry on a nail, and found in the counting, as she always did, a small firm comfort. She had been 3 days under that roof, and had not yet so much as met him when she came up to her west wing, sitting room one dusk, to find that the calling card had followed her, a second of Mr. Craddock Festing's large soiled cards, left this time not at a lawyer's elbow, but upon her own table in her own borrowed room, propped against the inkstand where she could not miss it. And below the flourishing engraved name, in the same pressing pencil as before, a single line had been added, in a hand grown bolder now that he was on his own ground: "Trust Miss S. Will. Have satisfied herself the mortgage stands fully discharged at Michaelmas last. Much may be spared all parties." She stood with the card in the failing light and read the line twice over. And for the first time since the Green Stick parlor at Ludlow, she felt a small, cold finger laid against her composure. Not fear, exactly, for she had her dates and her receipt book and her one fixed point driven deep in honest ground, but unease, the particular unease of an exact woman who hears a confident man speak of a payment she has searched for, page by page and day by day, in the dead man's own broken book, and knows for a fact it's not there. Discharged at Michaelmas, the 29th of September. She set the card down very precisely, squared it to the edge of the table, and crossed to the casement to look down at the dim shapes of the skeps in the blue dusk. And she thought, with the same steadiness she brought to a swarm hanging heavy in a low bow, that a man does not insist so warmly upon a thing that is true things, in her experience, had no need to call twice and leave their card, and that she had best, very soon and very quietly, find out exactly what paper this Mr. Craddock Festing believed he held, and on what day a dead man was supposed to have signed it. She came to Marsden Priory on a still gray afternoon at the latter end of the month, when the mist lay along the river meadows in long, pale ribbons, and the rooks went up out of the elms in slow, complaining wheels, and the great house stood at the end of its avenue with that particular dignity that very old stone keeps even when it has begun, quietly, to fail. She had not announced herself as a conqueror. She had written from Shrewsbury in her small, upright hand, 3 plain lines to say only that the holder of the bond would be in the neighborhood upon estate business, and would be obliged for the use of a room while certain papers were examined, and she came up the avenue in a hired chaise, with one modest trunk, and her worn green corded writing box upon her knee, and the brown calf pocket ledger in her reticule, and she alighted at the door not as a woman taking a kingdom, but as a woman who had been asked very civilly to look into the accounts of a house that was in trouble. That distinction she had settled in her own mind on the road, somewhere between the toll bar and the lodge gate, and she meant to keep to it, for she had read enough by now. In Quennell's broken book and Raysbury's careful copies, to know that a great many people under this roof were lying awake of nights, wondering whether the stranger who held the mortgage would be merciful or cruel. And she had no wish to let them dread her 1 hour longer than the law and her own slowness obliged. So she came down from the chaise composedly. In her dove-gray wool and her charcoal spencer and a slate shawl drawn close against the river damp, the little jet brooch at her throat, and her hands quiet in their gray kid mittens, and she stood a moment on the worn flags and looked up at the long mullioned front and the lichened parapet, and the smoke going up thin and grudging from only 2 chimneys of the dozen, and she thought, before ever she crossed the threshold, that this was a house being kept warm in 2 rooms by people who could not afford to heat it, and that the cold of it was not the cold of pride, but the cold of want dressed in pride's old coat. The door was opened to her by the housekeeper herself, Mrs. Tetlow, a spare, upright woman of 58, with iron-gray hair drawn smooth under a crisp, white linen cap, kind, shrewd, dark eyes that took the measure of the half-mourning and the modest trunk, and the level gray-green gaze all in one steady glance, a plain charcoal bombazine gown, and a clean white apron, and a heavy chatelaine of keys at her waist that chimed softly when she moved, and it was Mrs. Tetlow who said, in a voice carefully schooled to give nothing away, that the south chamber and the little adjoining closet had been made ready, and that the house was at the lady's service, and who then, having taken Lavinia's wet shawl with her own hands, and felt perhaps that the hands beneath it were not soft, idle hands, but hands that had worked, unbent the smallest degree, and added that there was a good fire above and a kettle near the boil, in a tone that was the first warmth the great cold hall had offered. In the days that followed, Lavinia came to know the others, each in his place, and each she saw, watching her sidelong to learn what manner of ruin had come among them. There was Mr. Locke, the steward of the home farm, a broad, weather-browned man of 62, with close-cropped gray hair and honest, pale eyes, and a worn brown frieze coat and mud-caked gaiters, and a blackthorn stick he leaned on at the yard gate, plain spoken to the edge of bluntness, who met her in the stable court with his hat in his hand and a careful, guarded courtesy that did not trouble to hide how little he expected of any creditor on this earth. There was his daughter, Hester Locke, a soft-spoken girl of 21 with mid-brown hair under a white lace cap and friendly hazel eyes and a sprigged dove gray print gown and a small silver cross on a gray cord, who bobbed her curtsy and blushed and could not for her life keep the curiosity out of her open country face. And there was the curate of St. Milburga's down in the village, Mr. Bramwell, a mild, scholarly man of about 34, with finely thinning sandy hair and gray eyes behind plain spectacles and ink-stained fingers and a plain black cassock gone green at the seams, who called on the second day to pay his respects to the lady at the Priory and stayed, almost without meaning to, 3/4 of an hour, because she had asked him a question about the wintering of bees, and he had not in years met a gentlewoman who knew that the question had an answer. These were the people of the house then, the keys, the land, the reading aloud, and the books, and Lavinia, who had spent her whole grown life among the people of a charity school, and learned there that a household is known not by its master's face, but by the faces of those who serve it, set herself quietly to know them before she so much as opened the strong box. The first thing she did with her own two hands on the very morning after her arrival was to see to the bees. She had brought the 6 skeps up with her from Ludlow. They had traveled in the carrier's cart, wrapped and roped and stopped with care. The bees gone quiet and clustered with the cold, 6 domed straw skeps of honey gold straw on their weathered oak stand. And she would not trust their settling to any hand but her own. Mr. Locke, sent for, came grumbling that he knew naught of bees, and stood by with his blackthorn stick, while this slight gray woman in the wide coarse straw hat and the trailing gray gauze veil and the rough-tan leather gloves walked the south front of the house slow and considering, her head a little on one side. Reading the wall as another woman might read a letter. She chose the long south wall of the old physic garden, a walled enclosure on the warm side of the house, where the stone gave back the sun and broke the north wind, where some careful hand, 100 years dead, had set out beds of lavender and rue and hyssop and southernwood now grown rank and woody, but living still, where a pear tree stood crucified and patient against the brick, and there she had the oak stand carried and leveled, and the 6 skeps set in their row, mouths to the southeast to catch the first sun, and she lifted each one and felt its weight against her arm and frowned over 2 of them that had come through the journey light. By noon the bees had found the air. In the thin, pale autumn sunlight a few of them drifted out and circled and went up the warm brick face of the house, and Mrs. Tetlow, watching from a window with her keys silent in her hand, said to nobody at all that it was the first new thing to come to Marsden in a 12-month that had not come to take something away. The brass smoker and the gray gauze veil Lavinia left on a shelf in the garden house against need, and she stood a while among the straw domes with her gloved hands folded, listening to that low, even, working murmur that she had loved since she was a child at her father's elbow, and was, for the first time since the lawyer's letter, entirely at peace. It was in such order that she liked to keep all things, and it was in such order that she meant next to take up the far heavier business of the house. For the house had a room made for that business, though it had long forgotten it. They called it the South Library, a long, low room running half the garden front, paneled in dark old oak, gone almost black with age and smoke. 3 deep window bays looking out over the very physic garden where the skeps now stood, a great cold hearth at the far end, and tier on tier of calf-bound volumes climbing into the dimness above, and down the center a long oak table scarred with 2 centuries of use. Hester Locke, it was settled, should sit with her there of a morning and read aloud while she worked, for the girl had a clear, pleasant voice, and Lavinia found that figures went the easier for a quiet human sound about them. And Mr. Bramwell, hearing of the library, sent up within the week 2 of his own books, a worn Aristotle and a newer treatise on the natural history of bees, with a shy note hoping the lady would forgive the liberty. So the long room woke from its sleep. A fire was suffered. At last, in the great hearth, the shutters were folded back from one bay, and then another. Mrs. Tetlow brought candles and a tray, and at the scarred oak table, in her fingerless gray, mittens against the morning chill. With the brown calf ledger at her right hand, and the stub of black lead pencil on its faded ribbon, and Hester's gentle voice going on softly somewhere behind her shoulder, Miss Lavinia Strangeways opened the green baize document case Mr. Raysbury had left in her charge, and began page by careful page to take the first true inventory of the bond. She did it as she did everything, slowly and once. She would not have it said that she had guessed at a figure, or rounded a sum, or let a date go by uncertain, and so she set it all down in her own small upright hand on fresh ruled leaves, the way she set down the weight and temper and stores of a hive, that she might know the whole of what she held and the whole of what was owed before she suffered herself to feel anything at all about it. The principal first, the great mortgage upon Marsden Priory and its 1,200 Shropshire acres, advanced, she saw now from the bank's own ledger copy, not all at one stroke, but in 3 sums across 9 years, as the family's need had pressed and pressed again, the whole now standing at a figure so large that Hester, glancing once over her shoulder and seeing it written plain, drew in her breath and read no more aloud for a space. Then the arrears. These she stated to herself once exactly to the day, the half-yearly interest unpaid for 2 full years and more, reckoned to the present quarter, with the small accruing weight of interest upon the interest set down beside it in a fainter line, a sum not so vast as the principal, but, to a family with no ready money, the very millstone of the thing, the cold particular figure that turns a great house into a trap. And against these, on the credit side of her clear new page, the home farm's rents, the Locke's careful husbandry of the demesne, the few tenant holdings, the timber, the mill dues, the whole modest yearly income of the place set out honestly, every shilling of it, so that she might see at a glance the one fact that mattered above all the rest, which was the fact of how the income stood against the burden. And when she had it all down, the principal and the arrears stated once to the day and the rents reckoned against them, she laid her pencil along the edge of the page and sat very still and read what the figures told her. And the figures told her something she had not looked to find. For they told her, when she set Quinnell's private memoranda beside the bank's formal ledger and read the two together, that the thing had been going on a very long time. Year upon year the interest had fallen due, and year upon year only a part of it, and then a smaller part, and then in the last years none of it at all had come in. And where another banker, any banker, would have called in his security and foreclosed and sold up the proud Festing's root and branch a half-dozen years since, and been within his strict legal right to do it, this spare-grave old man in rusty black had simply let it run. He had carried them. There it was in his own crabbed private hand. In the broken book she had read page by page in the Shrewsbury strong room, notes against the dates, half figures, small forbearances, here a half-year's interest quietly waived, and there a quarter's, here the word forborne, and there only a short stroke of the pen where demand should have stood and did not. He had advanced and advanced again into the family's need, and then he had not pressed. He had let the arrears mount on the paper, and had never once, in all those failing years, let the law fall upon the house. The whole vast debt that hung over Marsden was, she saw plainly now, very largely a debt of his own patience, a roof that one old man had been holding up with his open hand long after the family beneath it had ceased to be able to pay him for the holding, and the household feared her. She could not but see it, and seeing it, she could not but be moved. They feared her quietly and with dignity, as such people fear, but they feared her in every careful word. Mrs. Tetlow accounted to her for the smallest household disbursement with a still face and watchful eyes, as one who waited to be told that even this was now too much. Mr. Locke, when she walked the home farm with him, named over his beasts and his fields and his repairs in the flat-guarded voice of a man laying out his all before a creditor and bracing himself to hear it taken. Hester read the great figures aloud and blushed and faltered as though the very saying of them were a confession. They thought it was written in all their bearing. that the bond had passed from a known old master who had been merciful into the hands of an unknown woman who need not be. That she had come to count what was here and reckon what it would fetch, and turn them out by candle day into the cold, and they were too proud and too well bred to say so, and so they served her with a flinching courtesy that was harder to bear than any reproach. And Lavinia, who had been poor herself, who had kept the books of a charity school, and knew to a farthing what the dread of being put out of doors does to people who have nowhere on God's earth to go, felt it go through her like the river damp. She had come up the avenue resolved only to be exact. But exactness, she found, was not the whole of what was wanted of her. One gray evening, the inventory finished and squared and the candle burned low, she sat alone in the long south library, with a dead banker's broken book open before her at the last forbearance he had ever entered, and she looked from that small, failing patient hand to the dark window where somewhere below in the night. Her 6 skeps stood close clustered against the warm stone, keeping one another alive through the cold, and she understood all at once and entirely why an old man 3 weeks dead had wished this paper, of all the souls on earth, into her keeping. It was not that he had wanted the Priory seized. A man who had spent 10 years not seizing it did not leave his bond to a stranger to do at last the cruel thing he had refused to do himself. He had carried this family in silence, for some reason of his own that she did not yet wholly know, and being come to the end of his carrying, he had looked about for the one pair of hands he could trust to go on as he had gone, to hold the great debt without using it as a sword, to be owed everything and yet ruin nobody, to be just and not grasping. He had remembered, she thought, with her finger again on the little hard oval of jet at her collar, some grave, grateful debt of his own, and he had paid it forward into her keeping, and there in the dark library. Before ever she had heard the name of Mr. Craddock festing, or seen one stain upon his primrose waistcoat, Lavinia's strange ways made her resolve, quietly and once, as she made all her resolves, that she held this bond as a trust and not as a weapon, that she would not foreclose, that she would be to these proud, frightened people what the old man had been, a roof and not a ruin, and that whatever should now come against her, she would meet it standing upon exactness and mercy both, and yield neither. She did not yet know how soon, nor from what oily quarter the first blow would fall. It fell, when at last it came, upon a thin, bright morning some 11 days after she had come to lodge within the Priory itself. In the small, sober wing that Mrs. Tetlow had aired and warmed for her at the eastern end, where the paneling was old and the light came clean off the home meadow, and the rooks went over at 7 each day as regular as the tower clock. She had been at the bee skeps when the sound of wheels first reached her. They had been carried down from the physic garden at Ludlow in their straw and set by Mr. Locke's 2 men and under her own particular direction against the warm gray south wall of the Priory where the late October sun lay longest, and she had spent the better part of that hour bare-headed in the chill, her gray gauze veil thrown back and her tan gloves on, satisfying herself that the 6 domed skeps stood true upon their weathered oak stand, that the entrances faced as they should into the sheltered angle, that the cluster within the 3rd skep, which had swarmed late and which she had watched with some anxiety through the journey, was drawing close and warm against the cold. The brass smoker stood cold at her feet. She had no need of it. The bees in that thin sunlight were drowsy and slow, and went and came upon their last business of the year with a low contented note that she had learned, these many seasons, to read as a man reads a face. She was, in short, entirely herself and entirely at peace when the post-chaise came up the long carriage drive between the lime avenue with a great deal more noise than the matter warranted, and stopped and disgorged its passenger upon the gravel below the terrace, and she straightened from the steps with her gray eyes already grave and level, and knew without being told. Before ever he had crossed the gravel or raised the glass that swung at his breast, that the first blow had arrived. He came round the corner of the terrace with Mrs. Tetlow some paces behind him, and Mrs. Tetlow's broad, honest face was set in the particular flat civility that good servants keep for persons they have been obliged to admit and would not, of their own choosing, have admitted at all. He was a man of about 45, fleshy and florid, of middle height but running freely to stoutness, so that his too bright bottle blue coat with its row of brass buttons strained a little at the waist, and his biscuit-colored pantaloons strained a great deal at the knee, and beneath the coat very plainly to be seen in that searching morning light. He wore a waistcoat of primrose yellow that had once, perhaps, been a handsome thing, and was now marked low on the left side, with a faint dried stain, the color of old gravy that no brushing had quite lifted. His thinning, sandy gray hair was pomaded flat to a damp pink scalp. His eyes were of a pale, watery blue, a little prominent, never quite resting. His mouth wore a soft, damp half-smile that did not move when the rest of his face moved, as though it had been set there separately and forgotten. He raised, as he came, a quizzing glass upon a black silk ribbon, and through it surveyed first the wall, then the steps, then, with a slow, insolent deliberation he plainly believed to be a courtesy, herself, her dove-gray gown, her charcoal spencer, the slate shawl, the small jet brooch, the tan gloves still upon her hands. "Miss Strangeways," he said, lowering the glass and letting it swing, I apprehend. "Miss Strangeways of Ludlow. I had been told I should find you among the bees." He said the last word as a man says a thing faintly comical, faintly contemptible, a small eccentricity to be indulged in a woman of no consequence. And the soft mouth held its half-smile, and a faint mingled scent of snuff and orris root came off him on the cold air, and Lavinia, drawing off one tan glove finger by finger with perfect composure, inclined her head the precise degree that civility required, and not 1 degree more, and said only, "You have the advantage of me, sir, festing," said he, and made her a bow that brought a small grunt from him at the waist. Mr. Cradock festing. Of this house he spread one soft white hand toward the long gray front of the Priory with its mullioned windows and its 1,200 acres rolling away behind, and upon the smallest finger of that hand a heavy seal ring caught the light. Or of this house I should more properly say, as it is shortly and rightfully to become, for I am, Miss Strangeways, the nearest in blood to the unentailed remainder, the expectant heir, as any attorney in Shrewsbury will tell you, these many years past the acknowledged claimant upon the festing seat. And it is in that character, that settled, that established character, that I have ventured to wait upon you. For I am given to understand, and here the watery eyes did rest at last full upon her, and the half-smile widened by some small wet degree, that you have come into this neighborhood under a most singular impression. Under the impression, Miss Strangeways, that you hold some paper, some bond. He let the word fall and lie there on the gravel between them like the stain upon his waistcoat. I am come, in the kindest spirit in the world, to relieve you of that impression before it should carry you to any expense or any embarrassment? She did not answer him at once. She had learned at the skeps and over the ledgers and in the long patient school of a poor clergyman's house that the surest way to be told a great deal is to say very little. That a man who has come to frighten you will, if you only stand quiet and grave and let the silence stretch, hurry to fill it with more than he meant to give. So she drew off the second glove and folded the pair across her hand, and looked at him with her level gray-green eyes and her calm, well-shaped mouth resting in its accustomed self-possession, and said, in a low, even voice with no tremor in it whatsoever, "Will you walk in, Mr. Festing? It is cold here for paper." And she turned, without waiting upon his answer, and went before him along the terrace and in at the garden door that Mrs. Tetlow held, and so to the small south library where the fire was lit and Hester Locke had been reading and now rose, soft-haired and startled in her sprigged gray print, and gathered her book and her gray cord and her little silver cross, and went out at a glance from Lavinia, quietly closing the door, and Lavinia took her place in the upright chair beside the table where her own brown calf-pocket ledger lay, and her stub of black lead pencil on its faded ribbon, and folded her hands and waited. He was not slow to come to it. He had refused the chair she indicated, and had taken instead a slow proprietary turn about the room, raising his glass at the portraits, at the long shelves, at the very molding of the ceiling, as a man counts over goods he means shortly to possess. And then he came to the table and laid upon it, with a flourish of the soft white hand, a folded document of stiff parchment sealed with a great blob of red wax and tied with green tape gone a little frayed. "I will not," said he, "trespass long upon your patience, nor upon your feelings, Miss Strangeways, which I make no doubt are tender in the matter. A single lady of small means, persuaded by I know not what country attorney that she has come into a great thing. The case is very short. The bond you suppose yourself to hold, the mortgage bond of the late Mr. Josiah Quinnell upon this estate, with its arrears, is so much waste paper. It is discharged. It is paid. It was redeemed, Miss Strangeways, and the mortgage cancelled, and the whole sum acquitted, at the Michaelmas audit last, upon the 29th day of September, by deed of redemption duly executed, sealed and witnessed, of which this," and he tapped the parchment with one heavy, ringed finger, "is the very instrument. The money was found, the debt was satisfied, Mr. Quinnell's claim upon Marsden Priory was extinguished and released full 3 weeks before, well, the half-smile flickered, before any question of inheritance could arise. So that whatever scrap the old banker may have left to you in his dotage, whatever assignment he may have scratched off to a clergyman's daughter he had perhaps met once at a charity night and felt some sentimental pang over, it assigns you nothing. It assigns you the right to a debt already paid. It is a key, Miss Strangeways, to a door that stands open and empty. You have had your journey for your pains." And he stood back and let the glass swing, and watched her with the soft, damp confidence of a man who has played his single card and believes it an ace, and waited, plainly, for the color to go out of her face, for the small gloved hands to flutter, for the country gentlewoman to crumble before the law and the man and the red wax. He waited for tears, or for anger, or for that flustered torrent of unconsidered objection by which the frightened betray how little they understand. He got none of these. Lavinia Strangeways sat entirely still. She looked, for the space of perhaps 3 slow breaths, not at him at all, but at the folded parchment lying on her table between her own worn brown ledger and the cold gray window. And then she said, in the same low, even voice, without heat, without hurry, with no more agitation than she might have brought to the reading of a swarm or the casting up of a column of figures, "May I see the date?" Mr. Festing. And a witnessing hand. It was not at all what he had looked for. The half-smile held, but something behind the watery eyes shifted and grew wary. The date," he repeated. "The witnessing, you will permit me," she said, and did not make it a question, and drew the parchment toward her across the table with two ungloved fingers, gently, as one draws a comb frame from the hive, and turned it to the light of the window. She did not unfold it wide, she did not pore over the body of the deed, the long engrossed recitals, the swelling formulae of release and acquittance in which a less exact mind would have lost itself, and in which she understood very well he had meant her to lose herself. She went straight, with that unhurried account-keeper's directness, to the foot of the instrument where the date stood, and the signatures, and the seals, and there she stopped and was very quiet, and Mr. Cradock Festing, watching her, found that he did not at all like her quietness. For Lavinia Strangeways read figures and dates as another woman reads a letter from a friend, not letter by letter, but at a glance, with a whole sense of them springing up entire. And she read, besides, the hand that made them, the pressure and the tremor and the lie of the ink, with the same trained patient eye that could tell a queenless hive by the note of its humming, or a coming frost by the set of the bees at the door 3 days before the glass had stirred. And what she saw, sitting still in the upright chair with the fire small at her side, was 4 things. And she set them by in her mind one upon another as she set figures in a column, in their order, without yet saying any one of them aloud. She saw first that the date engrossed at the foot was indeed the 29th of September last, Michaelmas, written full and fair. She saw, second, that one of the 2 witnessing signatures, and the principal seal of release above them, the seal and the signing hand that mattered, the hand by which the whole deed stood or fell, purported to be the proper hand and seal of Mr. Josiah Quinnell himself, the mortgagee, releasing his own claim, for who else could acquit the debt but the man to whom it was owed? She saw, third, and here her grave gray eyes grew very still indeed, that the hand which had formed that signature, Josiah Quinnell, in its rusty crabbed banker's characters with the long crossed final L, was a hand striving, and not perfectly succeeding to be another hand, that the downstrokes had a copied evenness, a drawn carefulness, a small betraying tremor at the turns, such as she had seen once before in her life, when a dishonest under gardener at the school had written out a tradesman's receipt that was none of the tradesman's, the difference, exact and unmistakable to an eye like hers, between a hand that flows from the wrist of its owner and a hand that is labored after from a copy held alongside. And she saw, fourth and last and quietest of all, deep within her own ordered memory, a thing she did not need any parchment to tell her, that Mr. Josiah Quinnell, the Shrewsbury private banker, the spare, grave old man in rusty black, with his ledger open on his knee, the patron of her dead father and the maker of her trust, Mr. Josiah Quinnell, had been 3 weeks dead and lying in the cold of St. Chad's churchyard upon the 29th of September, that he had died, as Mr. Raysbury's own first letter had told her, and as the assignment in her keeping was itself dated to prove. Fully 3 weeks before Michaelmas, and that a dead man does not sit at an audit table and sign away his bond. She did not say it. That was the discipline of her, the long apiary patience. She did not, in that bright cold room fling the lie in his fleshy face, did not cry out upon the forgery, did not give him the smallest gift of seeing that she had seen. A swarm is not taken by snatching at it. A column is not proved by shouting the total before it is cast. She lifted her eyes from the deed to Mr. Cradock Festing's watery prominent ones, and she said only, very low and even, "I am obliged to you, sir, for bringing me this in person. It is a grave instrument, and asks a grave answer, and you will not think me uncivil if I do not give you one across a table within the hour of seeing it. These are matters for the attorneys. With your leave I will keep this by me." Her ungloved hand rested, light and final, upon the parchment, or rather, since you will wish to keep your own deed, I will ask you to leave it with no one but yourself, and I will have my solicitor wait upon yours, that the thing may be done in form. I do not deal in papers I have not weighed. The half-smile had gone a little fixed. He had expected to carry away either her surrender or her tears, and he was carrying away neither. He was carrying away a quiet woman in dove gray, who had looked at the foot of his deed for the length of 3 breaths, and then thanked him and asked for the attorneys. "You will find, ma'am," he said, and there was the first thin edge of something less oily under the orris and the snuff. "You will find it the merest formality. The deed is unanswerable. I had hoped to spare you the expense of being told so twice." "Then we are agreed, sir," said Lavinia, rising so that he must rise too, "that it should be answered, and answered in form, and the expense met by whomsoever the right of it falls upon. Mrs. Tetlow will see you to your chaise. The drive is cold, you will wish to be gone before the light turns." And there was nothing in her voice he could take hold of, no anger to feed on, and no fright to enjoy, only that level gray courtesy that shut upon him like a door. And he took up his parchment in its frayed green tape, and made her again his straining bow, and went, raising his glass once more at the portraits as he passed them as though to remind them whose they shortly were to be, and so out. And presently the noisy wheels went away down the lime avenue and were gone, and the rooks settled, and the house was quiet. For a long moment Lavinia stood where she was beside the cold window, with her 2 gloves still folded in her hand, looking out at the 6 straw skeps against the gray south wall, and the slow last bees going and coming in the thin sun, and her face had not changed at all, but her grave mouth had set, and a small steady light had come up far back in the gray-green eyes, the light of a woman who has been shown a lie and means, without noise and without mercy, and entirely within the law, to take it apart. Then she crossed to the bell and rang it, and to Mrs. Tetlow, who came, she said 3 things, quietly and in order, that Hester might come back to her reading when she chose, that a note must go this hour by the surest hand to Mr. Raysbury at his chambers in Shrewsbury, begging him to come out to the Priory upon a matter of the first moment, and to bring with him, if it could by any means be had, the late Mr. Quennell's own bank receipt book for the Michaelmas quarter, and that she herself was not to be disturbed until he came. And when Mrs. Tetlow had gone, the keys at her waist chiming down the passage, Lavinia Strangeways sat down again at the table, and drew the candle nearer though it was day, and opened her own worn brown calf pocket ledger to the page where, in her small, exact, upright hand, she had set down on the morning of her coming the one date that mattered above all the others, the date of Mr. Josiah Quennell's death, copied from the solicitor's first letter, the 8th of September, and she took up the stub of black lead pencil on its faded ribbon, and laid it beside the figure. and waited with perfect patience for the bank's receipt book to be laid down upon the same table beside her own, that the two records, the true and the forged, might at last be set column against column in the light. The receipt book came down upon the table within the half hour, carried by Mr. Raysbury himself, who had ridden out from Shrewsbury that morning with the green baize document case under his arm and his gold-rimmed spectacles fogged from the cold, and who set the heavy ledger down beside her small one with the particular care of a man who knows the weight of paper and would not bruise a corner of it. And so it was that when the household was at last gathered in the long south library of Marsden Priory, in the gray clear light of a Shropshire forenoon late in October, the two records lay there, waiting, column against column, the true and the forged, before ever a word of the business was spoken aloud. They came in by ones and twos, the people of the house and the parish, summoned not by Lavinia, but by Mr. Craddock Festing, who had let it be known the day before, in his soft damp way, raising the quizzing glass on its black silk ribbon and letting it fall again, that he meant to settle the matter of the bond once and for all before witnesses, that there might be no whispering afterward of how a gentlewoman had been hardly used. He had chosen his ground, or thought he had. He stood near the tall window in his primrose yellow waistcoat, the stain upon it catching the light, his bottle blue coat with its brass buttons too bright for the sober room, and his soft white hands folded upon the head of a Malacca cane. And he had about him the air of a man who has dealt his cards and is only to wait for the trick to fall to him. Mrs. Tetlow came in with the chatelaine of keys chiming at her waist and took her place near the door with her shrewd dark eyes moving once over the banker's man and then to Lavinia and stayed there. Mr. Locke the steward came in from the home farm with the cold still on his frieze coat and the mud of the lower meadow on his gaiters, and leaned upon his blackthorn stick by the cold hearth, and said nothing, but watched. Hester Locke slipped in behind her father and stood with her hands folded in her white apron, the little silver cross on its gray cord rising and falling at her throat. And Mr. Bramwell, the curate, came last of all, in his plain black cassock, his ink-stained fingers carrying a thin calf-bound volume he had not had the chance to put down, his mild gray eyes behind their plain spectacles passing from face to face with the gentle attention of a man more used to reading a parish register than a quarrel. They made a half-circle in the long room, and the autumn light lay across the carpet between them, and into that light Mr. Festing stepped forward and began to speak. He spoke pleasantly. That was the thing of him that Lavinia had marked from the first, and marked again now. He was never loud, never coarse, but laid his words down soft and damp as a hand laid upon one's sleeve, and there was in every sentence the half-smile that did not reach the watery blue eyes. He was grieved, he said, that it should come to this. He had hoped the lady might be brought to see reason in private, woman to man, family to, he hesitated upon the word, and let the quizzing glass swing to stranger. But since she would not, he must lay the plain fact before them all, that none might afterward say he had crept upon her in the dark. The plain fact was this, that the mortgage bond upon Marsden Priory, of which the lady made so much, of which she had come all the way from her bees and her charity school near Ludlow to take possession, was so much waste paper. It had been redeemed. It had been paid and discharged in full at the Michaelmas audit, the 29th of September last, by the family of Festing, and a deed of redemption drawn and signed and sealed to that effect. And here. He drew it from within the bottle blue coat with a small flourish of folded parchment. The wax seal upon it dark and whole. Here was the deed itself, signed in the hand of the late Mr. Josiah Quinnell, the banker, who had held the bond and who had received the money and set his name to the discharge of it. He held the parchment up so that the light fell through it and showed the shadow of the writing. There was, he said, an end of it. The bond she carried was the husk of a debt already dead. He was sorry for it. He would not press her for the cost of her journey. And he laid the deed down upon the table, upon the very table where the two ledgers lay, with the air of a man setting the last stone upon a wall, and folded his white hands again upon the cane, and waited. Lavinia Strangeways did not rise at once. She sat a moment longer in her dove-gray wool, with the slate shawl across her shoulders and the small jet mourning brooch at her collar. Her grave gray-green eyes upon the folded parchment, and she let the silence sit, as she would let a hive settle before she opened it, knowing that a thing approached in haste stings, and a thing approached in patience yields. Then she looked to Mr. Raysbury, and the old solicitor inclined his silver head the smallest degree, and she rose. She did not reach for the forged deed. She reached instead for her own worn brown calf pocket ledger, and opened it to the page she had made ready on the morning of her coming, and she set it down open before them, and she laid the stub of black lead pencil upon the date, and she said, in her quiet level voice that carried the better for being quiet, that before they considered the deed Mr. Festing had laid before them, she would ask the company to hold one figure in their minds, and that figure was a date. The date was the 8th of September. It was the date, she said, of the death of Mr. Josiah Quinnell. She had it from the solicitor's first letter to her, written upon the settling of the estate. She had copied it into her own book in her own hand the morning she arrived in this house. Before ever she had heard the name of any redemption deed, before there was any quarrel to color it, and Mr. Raysbury, she said, had the original of that letter in his case, and the register of the parish of St. Chad in Shrewsbury, where Mr. Quinnell was buried, would bear the same date carved already in the stone, and Mr. Bramwell, who knew the keeping of registers, might be trusted to read it for them. The curate looked up sharply at his name, and his mild eyes went from her face to the old solicitor and back, and a small line came between his brows, for he had begun before the rest of them to see the shape of the thing coming. Mr. Raysbury drew the letter from the green baize case and unfolded it without hurry and laid it beside her ledger. And the 2/8 of September lay there together, the printed clerk's hand and her own small upright one, and they agreed. The 8th of September. Lavinia let that settle too. Then she turned to the great receipt book of the bank that Mr. Raysbury had carried out from Shrewsbury, the book in which, by the long custom of that careful private house, every sum received over the counter or by the hand of any clerk was entered the same day in ink and ruled off, and the receiving clerk's initials set against it, and she said that this was no record of hers nor of Mr. Raysbury's making, but the bank's own book, kept by the bank's own men, and that any of the company who doubted it might send to Shrewsbury and have the head clerk himself attend to, swear to its keeping. And she opened it where the green silk marker lay, at the last leaves of the late summer and the autumn, and she turned the pages slowly, that they might see, and she read the entries aloud, the small sums and the great, the rents and the bills and the discountings, down through the latter days of August and into September, and there, upon the leaf that carried the entries of the first week of that month, the hand changed. Up to and upon the 7th of September, the entries ran in one fashion, close and regular, and after the 7th there was a short space, and then the entries resumed in another clerk's hand, and with a different ruling, as the entries of a house in mourning will, where the master who oversaw the daily balancing has been carried out and a junior set in his place. And nowhere she turned the leaves forward slowly, the length of the table, that every eye might follow her finger down the columns, nowhere in the whole of the month, not upon the 29th of September, not upon any day before it or after it, was there entered the receiving of any sum from the family of Festing, nor any redemption, nor any discharge of the bond upon Marsden Priory, nor so much as a shilling of the arrears. The book recorded no payment. The last entry that bore upon the Priory at all stood weeks before the alleged discharge, and it was an entry of arrears unpaid, in the old close hand, in the hand of a man by then already 3 weeks in his grave, by the day the deed claimed his living signature. She closed the receipt book, and the small sound of it carried in the quiet room. And then, and only then, did she reach for the deed of redemption that Mr. Festing had laid upon the table with such a flourish, and she did not snatch it nor brandish it, but drew it toward her with 2 fingers, as one draws a paper one already knows the worth of, and she opened it flat in the light. And she said that the company should look now, not at what the deed claimed, but at what the deed was. Here was the date of it, written plain across the head, the 29th of September, the day of the Michaelmas audit. And here at the foot was the signature, Josiah Quinnell, in the banker's own hand, the spare, upright banker's hand that Mr. Raysbury knew well and could match against 100 true signatures in his case if it were asked of him, and that the portrait of the old man in rusty black above the south stair had been signing all his long, careful life. The hand was very like. She granted it freely. She would not have the company think her case rested on any quarrel of penmanship, on the cross of a T or the tail of a Y, for such quarrels could be argued both ways till doomsday by paid men with magnifying glasses. No, her case did not rest upon whether the hand was like. Her case rested upon this, that the hand, like or unlike, true or copied, was set down upon the 29th of September, and that upon the 29th of September Mr. Josiah Quinnell had been 3 weeks dead. A dead man does not sign. A dead man does not attend a Michaelmas audit, nor count out the receiving of a great sum, nor take up the pen and discharge a bond and set his seal to it. Whoever had drawn this deed, and she did not, she said, looking once and only once at Mr. Festing's florid face, name the man who had drawn it. Whoever had drawn it had been so careful of the hand that he had forgot the calendar. He had labored to make the dead man's name live again upon the paper, and had given it a day to live upon that the dead man could not by any contrivance under heaven have lived to see. The deed did not need a witness against it. The deed was its own witness against itself. It said in one line that Josiah Quinnell signed on the 29th of September, and the stone in St. Chad's churchyard said, and the bank's own book said, and the solicitor's letter said, and her own poor little ledger copied out before ever there was a quarrel said, that on the 29th of September Josiah Quinnell had 3 weeks lain in the ground. Set the two together, she said, and lay her hand flat for a moment upon the forged parchment and the true receipt book both, the one beneath each palm, and there is no need of me, nor of Mr. Raysbury, nor of any further word from any of us. The papers speak. They contradict one another, and one of them is the bank's own keeping, and the parish's own carving, and the other is a thing that claims a dead man rose to sign it. The room had gone very still. The autumn light had moved a little upon the carpet. Mr. Bramwell, the curate, had set his thin calf-bound volume down upon a side table without looking at it, and his ink-stained fingers were pressed together before his mouth, and his mild gray eyes were fixed upon Mr. Festing with something that was not anger, but was very near to sorrow. Mr. Locke had straightened from his blackthorn stick. Hester's silver cross had gone quite still at her throat, and Mrs. Tetlow, by the door, had folded her hands over the chatelaine of keys, and there was in the set of her mouth the grim small satisfaction of an old servant who has watched a proud false thing met at last by a quiet true one and found wanting. Mr. Cradock Festing did not give it up at once. That was not in him. The watery blue eyes had widened a little, and the soft half-smile had stiffened upon the florid face, but he gathered himself, and he blustered, in the soft, damp way that was his blustering, that this was all very ingenious, very clever in a lady, very prettily set out, but that there might be 100 explanations, that the date upon the deed might be a clerk's slip, a slip of the pen. The audit days set down out of custom, though the business were done earlier, and Lavinius said, before he had finished, without heat, that if the business were done earlier, then it was done while Mr. Quennell yet lived, and the receiving of so great a sum would stand in the bank's book upon the day it was done, in the old close hand, and he was welcome to find it there and put his finger on it. And the receipt book lay open upon the table between them, and Mr. Festing did not cross the room to find it, because there was nothing there to find, and every soul in the long library knew in that moment that there was nothing there to find. He raised the quizzing glass on its black silk ribbon and let it fall. He said something further, lower, about the costs and the trouble, and how a wiser woman might have taken a settlement and gone home to her bees, and Mr. Raisbury, who had said almost nothing the whole while, contented to let his client's own records do the speaking as a good solicitor will, when the records are sound, took off his gold-rimmed spectacles and folded them and said, in a dry, even voice, that he had heard enough to know his own duty, which was to lay the deed of redemption, the receipt book, the letter, and the dates before the proper authority at the next assize, that the law might consider how a discharge came to be signed in a dead man's hand, and that he had further the proofs of the lady's own title and lineage, the verbatim sealed deed of assignment, the late Mr. Quennell's own settling of his estate, the line by which the bond had come lawfully and wholly to Miss Strangeways, and to none other, all of it whole and in order in his case, against which the family of Festing had set nothing but this one false parchment that destroyed itself in the reading. At the word assize, Mr. Festing's florid color changed. The fleshy face went from red toward a doughy gray, and the soft white hands tightened upon the head of the malacca cane, and for a moment the room thought he might bluster yet again. But he was, whatever else, a man who could read the fall of a trick, and he read this one, and he knew that he was beaten not by clamor, nor by any man's fist, nor by any cleverness he could turn back upon her, but beaten by her records, and by the law that the records armed, and by the plain, unbroken line of the lawful title, and there is no arguing with a date in a churchyard. He withdrew. He did it with what poor grace was left him, gathering the bottle-blue coat about him and making a stiff small bow toward the window rather than toward the lady, and saying that he would take advice, that this was not the end of it, though every one present heard in the saying of it that it was the end of it. And he went out through the long library with the quizzing glass swinging and the faint scent of snuff and orris trailing after him, and Mrs. Tetlow stood aside from the door to let him pass and did not curtsy. And the door closed, and he was gone. And then there was the breath that a room lets out. Mr. Locke struck the floor once softly with the blackthorn stick, which was as near as that grave man came to triumph, and Hester let out a small sound and pressed her hand to the silver cross, and Mr. Bramwell took up his volume again and held it without opening it, and looked at Lavinia with his mild eyes full. But it was Mr. Raysbury who, putting his spectacles back upon his nose and beginning to gather the papers into the green baize case, said the thing that brought them all round to look at her, that the deed was a forgery plain enough to hang or transport the man who had drawn it, and that the lady had only to say the word and he would lodge the matter at the assize the very next sitting, and the law would deal with Mr. Cradock Festing as the law deals with those who counterfeit a dead man's hand. And the company waited, for it seemed to them only just and more than just that the oily man in the stained primrose waistcoat who had come into this grave gentlewoman's house to cheat her of her right before her own assembled household should answer for it to the full. But Lavinia Strangeways did not say the word. She had sat down again, quietly, at the table, her hand resting upon the closed receipt book and her own small brown ledger, and she was a moment in answering, and when she answered it was without any flourish of mercy, as plainly as she had read the columns. She said that she would not prosecute. She said it once, and then, seeing the surprise move round the half-circle of faces, she said a little more, that she had not come into Shropshire to ruin a man, nor to fill an assize court with the family's shame, nor to make of Marsden Priory a byword in every market from Ludlow to Shrewsbury, that the law had done already what she had needed of it, which was to make the false thing plain and the true thing safe, and that to carry it further, to drag the man through the dock and the gaol, would be to take a kind of payment in his disgrace that she did not want, and that her father, and here her grave gray-green eyes went, for the briefest moment, to the small jet brooch at her collar that held the lock of his hair, that her father would not have thought a Christian woman ought to want. The bond was hers, secure and proven. The deed was waste. The man was beaten, and the household knew him beaten. That was enough. She asked only one thing of them all, she said, and she asked it of Mr. Raysbury and of Mrs. Tetlow and of every soul in the long room, and it was a small thing and the whole of what she wanted, that the matter now be let lie, and that she be left in peace, left to her ledgers and her keeping, and when the worst of the cold was past, to the 6 bee skeps she had asked Mr. Locke to set against the warm south wall of the Priory garden, and that no more be said of Mr. Cradock Festing in that house than was said of any other thing that had been weighed in the light and found wanting and put away. And so the household, which had come in expecting to see a gentlewoman cheated, and had stayed to see her quietly vindicate her right by nothing more than a date and a book, and her own exact unhurried record-keeping, went out from the long library by ones and twos as they had come, into the gray October forenoon, with a new thing settled in their minds about the slight, upright woman in dove-gray, who kept her accounts so close, and none of them, not Mrs. Tetlow with her keys, nor Mr. Locke with his stick, nor the curate with his books, nor Hester with her silver cross, and least of all Lavinia herself, sitting on alone now at the table, with her hand upon the 2 ledgers and the candle burning, needlessly in the daylight. Had yet the smallest notion of why a Shrewsbury banker she had met but never met, and heard named but twice in all her life, should have laid so strange and so great a thing into the hands of an orphaned clergyman's daughter who kept bees and books near Ludlow, nor what manner of old kindness, long carried and longer remembered, had moved a spare grave man in rusty black to do it. The answer, when at last it came, did not come all at once, nor by any single revealing stroke, but settled upon her slowly through the back end of that October as a frost settles upon a garden, not seen to arrive, only known by morning to have come, and it came to her first, not out of any book or paper at all, but out of the plain, ordinary living of the days. The way the household and the parish and the home farm closed quietly round her in the wake of that morning in the library, so that before she had any notion of why she had been given the thing, she had already begun, without designing it, to be the kind of woman to whom such a thing might rightly be given. For she did not. When festing was gone, and the paper folded away, and the field hers past dispute, sit on in the great cold house behind her ledgers, as a creditor sits over a debt, counting what was owed and waiting upon her arrears, she did instead the small, unremarkable things she had always done, in the place where she now found herself doing them, and the place took note. On the Sunday she walked down through the wet park to St. Moburgus with Hester at her side and Mrs. Tetlow a pace behind, and she sat in the family pew that the Festings had sat in for 200 years, sat in it plainly, in her dove gray and her jet brooch, with her father's lock of hair at her throat, and made no more of it than if it had been the bench in the school chapel at Ludlow. And she found the responses in the old worn prayer book with the Festing arm stamped upon its cover, and she gave the curate, Mr. Bramwell, in the pulpit above her in his white surplice, with his mild gray eyes behind his plain spectacles, the grave, still attention of a clergyman's daughter, who had heard the offices read all her life and knew the difference between a man who meant them and a man who got through them, and she knew before he was done that this one meant them. And after the service, in the muddy churchyard among the leaning slate headstones with the rooks going over, she did not sweep out at the head of the gentry, but stood and let the village come to her if it would, the cottagers and the dairy women and the old men who touched their hats. And because she asked one of them, an ancient bent laborer named Price, a plain question about the set of the wind and the look of the sky, and got from him a plain weatherwise answer, and answered him back in the same coin out of her own bee-keeping knowledge, the word went round the parish before nightfall that the new lady up at the Priory was no fine creature at all, but one who knew rain when. She saw it coming, and was not too proud to say so to a man with clay on his boots. It is by such small, unweighed things, and not by deeds and bonds, that a country place makes up its slow mind about a stranger, and the country round Marsden was making up its mind. On the Tuesdays and the Thursdays she went down to the little dame's school in the village that the Festings had endowed and let run thin, and she read to the children, not improving tracts, of which there was a dusty shelfful that no child had ever willingly opened but the natural history that Mr. Bramwell lent her, the wonders of the hive out of the old authors, how Aristotle himself had watched the bees and set down what he saw, how the workers were all sisters and the one great mother lay at the heart of the comb, how the swarm spoke to itself by dancing and by scent, and she read it to them in her low, even, unhurried voice, sitting on a hard form among the smaller ones with a child or two leaning against her gray skirts, and the children, who had expected a great lady to be either fearsome or absent, and it got instead a quiet woman who knew where the wild bees nested in the churchyard wall, and would tell them, came to watch for her at the school gate of a Tuesday morning the way they watched for nothing else in their narrow week. And she walked the home farm with Mr. Locke, who had at first gone beside her stiffly. A broad-weather-browned old man of 62 in his worn brown frieze coat and his mud-caked gaiters, with his blackthorn stick going down hard at every other step, and his honest pale eyes saying as plain as eyes could say it, that he had served the Festings man and boy, and would serve this newcomer civilly for his wage, and no further. And she had asked him no foolish lady's questions, and made him no foolish lady's promises, but had looked at the lower meadows that flooded every back end, and asked him why the old cut that should have carried the water off was choked, and had listened, actually listened, with her brown calf-pocket ledger open and her stub of black lead pencil going, while he told her at length, and with feeling exactly why, and whose fault it was, and what it would cost to put right. And somewhere in the middle of that telling the stiffness had gone out of the old man without his marking when, because he had found, after a barren stretch of years of being humored by his betters and overruled by his betters and never once heard by his betters, a person of quality who wrote down what he said as though it were worth the writing. By the end of that week, Mr. Locke was calling her ma'am in a different voice than he had begun with, and had taken, in the rough, plain-spoken, father-figure way that was native to him, to standing a little between her and the world, and the two of them, the upright, slender woman in gray and the broad old steward with his stick, could be seen of an afternoon down by the river arguing the price of a drain with the contented absorption of two people who have discovered, late and to their mutual surprise, that they understand one another exactly. And every fine forenoon she went to the bees. They had been carried up at last from the physic garden at the school, the 6 domed straw skeps on their weathered oak stand, brought the long way from Ludlow packed in straw on a slow cart, and set against the warm south wall of the Priory, where the late sun lay longest, with the brass smoker and the gray gauze veil on a bench beside them, and there, in her wide, coarse straw hat, with the gray gauze let down and her rough tan leather gloves drawn on, she would stand in the thin, pale autumn light among the drifting bees and do the unhurried autumn work of the apiary, judging the weight of the skeps in her 2 hands to know which had stored enough to winter and which would starve, watching the last foragers come in, heavy off the ivy bloom that was all the year had left them, reading the small fortunes of each colony with the same level attention she gave a column of figures. Mrs. Tetlow, the housekeeper, watched her at it from the terrace one such morning, iron gray under her crisp white cap, with her heavy chatelaine of keys at her waist, and said afterward in the servants' hall, with the air of one delivering a considered verdict, that she had served 3 mistresses in that house, and seen great ladies fret a whole morning over the hang of a curtain, but never before one who could stand stock still half an hour in a cloud of stinging insects and come away the calmer for it, and the saying of it, repeated, did the new mistress more good below stairs than a quarter's wages. So the autumn turned, and the days drew in, and a quiet, competent circle settled itself about Lavinia's strange ways almost before she was aware it had. The shrewd, kind housekeeper, the blunt, loyal steward, the gentle, bookish curate, and young Hester Locke, the steward's daughter, soft, mid-brown, under her white lace cap with her little silver cross on its gray cord, who had begun by carrying the lady's shawl and ended by becoming her companion, reading aloud to her of an evening in the South Library while the fires burned and the wind got up on the mind. None of them said to one another what was plainly forming among them, but a household knows when it has found a center, as surely as a swarm knows its queen, and this one had found one. And the center held the great fact of them all in her own quiet keeping, and did with it the thing that no one in the county, least of all the man who had braced himself to be ruined by it, had thought to look for. For Lavinia did not foreclose. She had every right in law to it. The bond was hers. The arrears were hers. The long unpaid interest had mounted year upon year until it stood as a sum that, called in, must have stripped Marsden Priory to the bare walls and turned the Festings out upon the road with what they could carry. And Mr. Raysbury, her grave Shrewsbury solicitor, sitting with her over the figures one evening with the firelight on his gold-rimmed spectacles, had laid the whole of it before her plainly, as in duty bound, the full reach of what she might do, not urging it, for he was not that kind of man, but setting it out, the entire iron extent of her power, that she might choose with her eyes open. And she had heard him out, level and still, with her hand resting on the worn brown calf of her pocket ledger, and had then said only, in her low, even voice, that she did not think she had been given the thing in order to do that with it. She could not yet have told him quite why she was so sure. She said it more as a beekeeper says that a hive will swarm out of a knowledge below the reasons. But she did not foreclose. She did better and harder than that. She sent for Cradock Festing, not in triumph, for there was no triumph in her, but in plain business. And she sat the florid, sweating man down across the great table where he had thought to break her. And she told him, with collected calm, that the arrears, the whole accumulated weight of them, the sum that had hung over his family like a debt of blood. She would forgive, that the bond would not be called, that the family should keep their home, and that the interest going forward should be set at so easy and so charitable a figure as scarcely to be felt, and might, against the right behavior, be in time forgiven too. And she did it without once making him feel the size of what she did, which is the whole art and the whole rarity of mercy, and the only kind that does not leave a wound where the wounded heels had been, so that the man went out from her not crushed, but, for perhaps the first hour of his soft self-serving life, ashamed, which in such a man is as near to grace as the matter is like to get, and more than he had earned. But she did not yet know why she had been so certain, and it was in the seeking of that, in the long evenings of that closing autumn, with the household quiet about her, that the second discovery came, and unfolded the whole strange bequest like a folded letter smoothed open at last. For among the papers that Mr. Raysbury had brought up from the bank in Shrewsbury, in the green baize document case, along with the deeds and the receipt books, there had come a small worn private book bound in rusty black calf, the late Mr. Josiah Quinnell's own. Not a ledger of the bank's business, but a thing more inward, half a memorandum book and half a journal, kept in a spare, upright, old-fashioned hand across 40 years, the place where a close and solitary man had sat down, very briefly and without ornament. The few things in his long, careful life that had touched him below the level of money. Lavinia had let it lie some days, feeling a delicacy about it, as one feels about reading the heart of the dead. But on a still wet evening, with the rain on the south windows, and Hester gone up to bed, and the one candle burning, she opened it, and turning the close-written years she came far back, to an entry in a younger, firmer hand, and read in it her own father's name. She had not looked for it. She had not, in truth, looked for anything but to understand a little better the grave, spare old man in the rusty black portrait that hung now at the stairhead, with his gold-rimmed spectacles and his banker's ledger open upon his knee, who had reached out of his grave to alter her whole life, and whom she had met but never met. And there it was, the Reverend Mr. Strangeways, her father, named and dated, in a year when she had been a child of 6 or 7 at the parsonage near Ludlow, and had known nothing of any of it, and reading on, slowly, in the rain, loud quiet, with her grave gray-green eyes going carefully along the faded lines, she pieced the old story out of the spare entries and out of a little packet of boyhood letters tied in faded tape that lay between the leaves, letters in 2 hands. A young Josiah Quennell's and a young Strangewayses kept these 40 years. There had been a time, she gathered, long before either man was the grave thing he became, when Josiah Quennell had been not a banker at all, but a clerk's son with nothing behind him, set out to make his slow way in the world, and there had come upon him in his young manhood a season of ruin and disgrace, a partner's fraud laid falsely at his door, a debt that was not his, a county that had closed its respectable face against him on the strength of an accusation and left him to go down with no hand put out, and the one man who had not closed his face was a poor young clergyman of small living and smaller influence, who had nothing to give but his word and gave it, who had stood up for Josiah Quennell when it cost him to do it and gained him nothing, had spoken for his honesty to men who would not hear it, had taken him into the parsonage and fed him at a thin table through the worst of the winter, and had lent him, out of a purse that could ill spare it, the few pounds that carried him to the place where he made his beginning again. The entry that recorded it was the barest in the book, a date, a sum, 4 dry words, lent by Mr. S., never to be spoken of, and beside it, years on, in the old man's later trembling hand, another line added, that the debt was paid in coin long since, and had never once been paid at all. For Quennell had offered, when he rose, to repay it 10 times over, and her father had refused, as Lavinia knew her father would have refused, having no notion that a kindness was a thing a man kept books on, and so it had stood between them, the one man unable to forget and the other long since dead, without ever guessing he was remembered, and the unpaid balance of it had ridden quietly in a private book through 40 years of a banker's life until it found, in a sealed deed of assignment, its strange and roundabout discharge. For Lavinia understood now, sitting very still, the candle low, the rain unceasing on the dark south glass, her hand flat upon the open page, that the proud festings whose home she held had been, these many years, the men whom Quennell quietly carried, that he had bought up their mortgage not to seize their seat, but to shelter it, holding the bond against the day when ruin would otherwise have taken them, asking nothing, letting the arrears mount and saying no word, that the old solitary banker had been doing in secret for a proud family that despised him, the very same thing the poor parson had once done for a disgraced young clerk, putting out the unseen hand that no one else would put out, and dying with no child of his own and no heart in him to let so faithful a charity fall into a hard creditor's grip, he had cast about for the one pair of hands in the world that he could trust to hold the thing as he had held it, to use the great power of it not to ruin, but to spare, and he had found those hands, by the long logic of a debt of the heart, in the daughter of the one man who had ever taught him, by plain example and without a word of preaching, what such a power was for, The bond had never in his mind been a weapon at all. It had been a trust, and he had laid the trust, as the last and largest installment of a kindness 40 years carried and never named, into the keeping of Lavinia Strangeways, who, before ever she read a line of why, had already, out of the plain habit of the heart her father bred in her, done with it the exact thing for which it had been given. And reading the last of it, with her father's name under her quiet hand, and the rain on the glass, Lavinia Strangeways came at last to the bottom of the thing, and understood why a banker she had never met had left her Marsden Priory and all the festings in it, and what manner of old kindness, long carried and longer remembered, the whole of this strange and weighty gift had been laid upon her quietly to repay. He came on a Tuesday. There was nothing of accident in it, and nothing of haste. The Duke of Wenlock was a man who did things on the days he had appointed for them in his own mind a week before, and a Tuesday in the first week of November suited him because the home park rides would be dry after the Sunday rain, and the light would last past 3, and because he had no wish whatever to call upon a Monday, when a great house is still gathering itself out of the Sabbath, nor upon a Saturday, when it is already leaning towards the next one. He sent no flowery note ahead of him, only a plain card by a groom the evening before. The Duke of Wenlock presented his compliments to Miss Strangeways, and would, if it were not inconvenient, do himself the honor of waiting upon her tomorrow forenoon, and the card lay on the salver in the south library through breakfast, square and unhurried and gray-edged, and Lavinia read it twice and set it back down and went out to the bees, because the bees did not keep Dukes's hours, and there was a skep on the end of the stand that had been restless in the night and wanted looking to. It is worth the saying plainly, because the whole quality of the thing turned upon it, he did not come as her rescuer. He had nothing to rescue her from. The bond was hers, and clear and festing was 3 counties gone, with his primrose waistcoat and his quizzing glass, and Mr. Raysbury's green baize case had closed upon a settled estate that no soft white hand would ever trouble again. The Duke had not lifted a finger in any of it, had not been asked to, would not, being the man he was, have presumed to offer. He came only because some 7 months before, at a county assembly charity night got up in the Shrewsbury rooms for the lying-in hospital, a tall grave widower in bottle green had stood at the edge of a chattering knot of people and heard a slender woman in half-mourning answer a foolish question about her bees with such exactness, such complete and unflustered plainness, telling a magistrate's lady who had asked archly whether the creatures were not a great deal of bother, that a stock well kept was less bother than a spaniel, and rendered a better account of itself at the year's end, and saying it without coquetry and without apology, as a person states a thing she has measured, that he had carried the sound of it home over the long mind in the dark, and had not, in all the months between, quite put it down. He had made one quiet inquiry, learned her circumstances, learned of the strange Quinnell legacy as half the county had learned of it, and had then done the hardest thing a patient man can do, which is nothing at all, until the thing was wholly and visibly hers, and could not by any squinting be called his doing. Now it was. So he came on a Tuesday. Mrs. Tetlow, who had her own opinions and kept most of them under her white cap, showed him into the south library at 11:15 with a face of such studied blankness that Hesterlock, carrying away the morning's chocolate cups, had to flee to the still room to laugh. He was exactly as Lavinia remembered him from the Shrewsbury rooms, and somehow larger in a country room than in a crowded one, 6 feet 2 of unhurried bone and weathered fair skin, dark chestnut hair, silvered a little at the temple, and worn a shade longer than the young men wore it. Deep-set gray eyes that took in the long room, the ledgers, the cold ash of last night's fire. The gray gauze veil hung on its peg by the garden door, and last of all the woman who rose from the writing table to meet him, all in one slow honest sweep, and missed nothing, and made no remark. He bowed. She curtsied. He hoped he did not take her from her work. She said he took her from the November audit of the bee accounts, which would keep. The bees being asleep and not given to fretting over their figures as their mistress was. And the grave half-smile he kept always in reserve came out then, just at the corner of his mouth, because that was precisely the kind of answer he had crossed 2 valleys to hear again. What followed was no whirlwind, and the chronicle that pretends courtship must be a fever does this one a disservice. It was a long autumn and a longer winter of Tuesdays, mostly, and the occasional Friday, and it went forward at the pace of 2 grown people who had each been disappointed enough by life to have grown careful, and steady enough by nature to be unafraid of slowness. He walked the home park with her. That came first and stayed longest in both their memories afterward. The wide bare park of Marsden Priory under a low pewter sky, the great avenue limes stripped to black tracery, the deer moving off in their gray clots at the edge of the bracken, the frost lying blue in the hollows till noon, and the rooks going up out of the elms in a slow complaining wheel, and the 2 of them pacing the gravel, and then the turf. She in her dove-gray wool and slate shawl and gray kid mittens, he in the heavy charcoal greatcoat with the triple cape turned up against the mind wind, his plain ebony crop tucked under his arm, and never once used to point or to hurry. They did not, on those walks, talk of the matter that everyone in 3 parishes was already talking of. They talked of the South plantation that wanted thinning, and of whether the Priory's home farm carried too much grass and too little wheat for a bad year, and of the curate Mr. Bramwell's borrowed book on the bees of Aristotle, which the Duke had read as a boy and remembered better than she expected, and they talked once, walking very slowly past the half-frozen carp pond with the light going. Of his late Duchess, dead these 4 years of a long wasting that no bath water had eased, and of her own father in his cold living above Clun, and they found that grief, spoken plainly between 2 people who do not dramatize it, is not a weight but a kind of furniture, something you may set a hand on. He never pressed. That was the whole art of him. If it was art and not simply the grain of the man, he let the silences be silences. And when at last he did speak, and he chose for it not the romantic dusk of the park, but a plain working forenoon in the South Library, the 2nd week of February, with the bond itself spread open on the green baize between them, where she had been showing him, at his own grave request, exactly how the arrears stood, and how she meant to forgive them by degrees so as not to shame the proud old. Festings, who still lived in the east wing on her sufferance, when he did speak, he laid one weathered hand flat on the table beside the parchment, not upon her hand, and said, in the quiet baritone she had come to listen for, Miss Strangeways, "You will observe that I have waited until there was nothing in your circumstances that my asking could mend, so that you might be in no doubt I ask for the only reason a man should. The estate is yours and safe. I want no part in the holding of it. I want only to be near the keeping of it, and of you, for the rest of a life I had thought rather emptied out. Will you marry me?" And she, who kept exact accounts of everything, and had kept exact account of this too, looked up from her father's name written under her own quiet hand on the assignment, and across the spare grave portrait that Mrs. Tetlow had by then hung above the library fire. The late banker Josiah Quinnell, in his rusty black, with his gold-rimmed spectacles and his ledger open on his painted knee, watching the room with the same level patience the living man must have had. And she said, simply, "Yes, I find I have wanted you to ask for some little while, and was beginning to keep a column for it," which was, from Lavinia Strangeways, very nearly a declaration of passion, and he had the wit and the grace to know it. The banns were read on 3 Sundays in the parish church of St. Moberga, the curate, Mr. Bramwell, reading them in his mild, ink-stained voice from the chancel step, while the small congregation of farm people and priory servants sat very still, and Hester Locke, in the second pew, wept happily into a borrowed handkerchief, and Mr. Locke the steward, broad and weather-browned in his one good coat, sat beside her, looking at the floor, with his honest, pale eyes suspiciously bright and his blackthorn stick gripped between his knees. I published the banns of marriage between Crispin, Duke of Wenlock, of the parish of Stretton-under-the-Hill, and Lavinia Strangeways, spinster, of this parish. If any of you know cause or just impediment, and there was no cause and no impediment. And the third Sunday's silence after that ancient question was the soundest and gladdest silence the old church had held in 20 years. The wedding itself was as quiet and as dignified as the two of them. There was no straining after grandeur, no county crush, no string of carriages 4 deep in the lane. It was kept on a Wednesday morning early in May, with the hawthorn out white in every hedge from Marsden under Edge to the Priory gates, and the cuckoo going in the Edge woods, and Lavinia walked to it on the arm of old Mr. Locke, who had asked for the office in a roundabout shame-faced way through his daughter and been granted it at once, because she had no father to give her, and the steward had stood nearer to one than any man living these 2. Years passed. She wore not white, but a soft pale dove gray silk, half a step out of her long half mourning and no more, with her father's small jet brooch and its lock of hair at the high collar still. She would not be parted from it, and the Duke would not have asked her. Mr. Raisbury came up from Shrewsbury, thin and upright, and beaming behind his gold-rimmed spectacles. His green baize case left behind in the gig for the first time in living memory. Mrs. Tetlow stood at the back in fresh black bombazine, with her keys silenced for the day. And the proud Festings of all the world came too, old Mrs. Festing in lavender, and Craddock's quieter cousins, brought low and made human at last by the very mercy that had spared them. Sitting near the front by the new Duchess's own written invitation, forgiven their arrears and their pride together, for she had meant from the first to hold the estate and not to ruin it, and a wedding is no place to keep a ledger of old wrongs open. That was the spring of it. The full payoff of the thing, though, the quiet sum of all the columns, you would have read best a whole year on, in the soft pale gold spring that followed, for the Chronicle is fondest of that 2nd May, when all the loud business was a year behind, and the new order had had time to settle into the stones. The 6 straw skeps stood by then on the warm south wall of the Priory, moved up from the old physic garden stand and set on fresh oak in the lee of the mellow brick, where the early sun struck longest, honey gold domes against the warm rose of the wall, the brass smoker and the gray gauze veil hung ready on their peg by the still-room door, and the bees going out in their thousands in the mild forenoons over the very lawns that a forged deed had once tried to take from the woman who kept them. Inside, above the south library fire, the spare-grave portrait of Josiah Quinnell still hung and watched. The banker who had never met his legatee, whose old debt of the heart had set the whole strange machinery turning, kept now in honor over the room where his trust had been read and understood and quietly, exactly fulfilled. The Festings kept their east wing. The home farm carried a little more wheat that year and weathered well. The arrears went down by gentle degrees, forgiven faster than they were ever pressed, in the unhurried March's fashion. The estate was held and was not ruined, and the great 1,200 acres of Marsden Priory lay safe under the keeping of two people who measured what they loved and loved what they measured. There are stories that begin with a kiss and end with a fortune seized. This was not one of them. There are stories that mistake noise for love and ruin for justice. This was not one of those either. This was a graver and a steadier thing, a debt of the heart 40 years carried, laid by a dying banker into the hands of the one woman alive who would honor it as he meant. A forged deed that witnessed against itself in a dead man's hand, a proud family spared by the very weapon raised to ruin them, and at the long patient end of it, after the law and the lineage and the ledgers had all spoken their plain truth, a tall widower in bottle green who waited until there was nothing left to rescue and then asked for the only reason a man should ask. And so, on the cool, pale gold spring morning of the 4th of May, 1819, in the parish church of St. Milburga at Marsden, under the mild Shropshire sun, Lavinia Strangeways, who had sat in self-possessed silence in the parlor near Ludlow and heard read aloud the deed of assignment left her by a banker she had never met, became, by the patient asking of the Duke of Wenlock, the 5th Duchess of Wenlock, and kept her 6 steps on the south wall of the priory she had held and would not ruin. In the unhurried March's fashion, her own late father had kept all his days.